Now that we understand modifiers and how to write them and how to use them and how to position them in different places in a sentence, let's talk about one of the traps you can fall into when writing with modifiers. And that's called the dangling modifier. As a reminder, a modifier is what we've been discussing in our last few units. It's an adjectival step. We've talked about 3 ways to begin a modifier. You can start it with a participle, you can start it with an adjective, or you can start it with a possessive pronoun. A dangling modifier is when it's not clear what noun the modifier is supposed to be modifying. This happens most often when left-branching modifiers don't modify the subject of the sentence, which they must do. Left-branching modifiers have to modify the subject of that sentence. So here's some examples of dangling modifiers. Wet and heavy, Fred shoveled the 6 inches of snow. Clearly here, the person who wrote this sentence was trying to modify snow with this modifier, wet and heavy. But because Fred is the subject of the sentence, it seems like Fred is being described as wet and heavy, but that's not what the writer intended. So this modifier is just dangling here, unconnected to the thing that it's supposed to be connected to. Next one. Her tongue out and tail wagging, Doris watched her dog run happily. Clearly, Doris's tongue is not out and her tail is not wagging. It's the dog that was meant to be described as tongue out and tail wagging. But since Doris is the subject, it seems like this should modify Doris, but that's not what the writer intended. Last example. Falling apart and needing repairs, Doug went to visit his newly bought house. Again, Doug is probably not the one falling apart and needing repairs, it's the house. This is supposed to modify the house, but since Doug is the subject, it seems like this modifies Doug. So, how do we fix a dangling modifier? The easiest way is to change the subject of the sentence. So instead of wet and heavy, Fred shoveled the 6 inches of snow, one option is this. Wet and heavy, the 6 inches of snow was shoveled by Fred. But that's not really a good option because what you've just done is made it a passive sentence unnecessarily. So, no, let's not do that. Let's figure out a different way to fix it. So here's another option. Wet and heavy, the snow Fred shoveled was 6 inches deep. So now we've changed the subject from here it was Fred, now the subject is the snow Fred shoveled. The snow being your simple subject. So now this modifier does modify the subject and the sentence seems much better. There's another way to do it too, though. And that way is you can also just get rid of the modifier at the beginning and just move it to right before the adjective it's meant, or right before the noun it's meant to modify. So instead of wet and heavy, Fred shoveled 6 inches of snow, just change it to Fred shoveled the 6 inches of wet, heavy snow. You've got the same idea. You've just cleared up what the modifiers are modifying. So here's another one. Her tongue out and tail wagging, Doris watched her dog run happily. So right now, Doris is the subject of the sentence, which is why it seems like it's her tongue out and tail wagging, but that's not what we need. So we need to shift this around a little bit. We could do her tongue out and tail wagging, Doris's dog ran happily. This does shift the subject from being Doris to now Doris's dog is the subject. So that fixes the modifier. We are missing something that was originally in the first sentence, which is that Doris watched. So if we need to add that, you could just add as Doris looked on. So sometimes to fix a dangling modifier, it might be easiest to drop an idea, but if you need that idea in there, you can find a way to get it. Last example. Falling apart and needing repairs, Doug went to visit his newly bought house. So right here, Doug is the subject of the sentence, so we need to fix that. What if we fix it this way? Instead of having the Doug went to visit his newly bought house after the modifier, what if we have it, Doug went to visit his newly bought house which was falling apart and needing repairs. So we've added a subordinative step. We've changed the modifier into a subordinative step. Now the which goes right to the house, and now it's clear what was falling apart and needing repairs. That's another way you can fix it. Change it from a modifier to a subordinative step, because then it's clearer. So you can adjust sentences that way too. So when you're using left branching modifiers, make sure that the modifier is modifying the subject of the sentence. And if you come across one where it's not modifying the subject of the sentence, you're going to have to fix it somehow. Mindeman out.